Nadira was a quiet village, hidden deep within lush green forests, where the rivers ran clear and the winds carried the scent of fresh earth. Life was simple, and the people lived in harmony, but for Zena, it was a place of sorrow. She was a girl of rare beauty, with kind eyes that held the weight of unspoken pain. Her heart was as pure as the morning sun, yet fate had not been kind to her. Zena's world shattered the day her father died. No one knew exactly how it happened. Some whispered that he had fallen into the deep ravines while hunting. Others believed there was something darker behind his sudden disappearance. But Zena knew one thing. Without him, her life would never be the same. Her mother, Bimkwe, once warm and loving, was now drowning in grief. She became vulnerable, desperate for protection, and in her weakest moment, she made a choice that would change Zena's life forever. She married Bato. Bato was not a man of kindness. He came to their home with a heavy presence, a voice that made the walls tremble, and eyes that held no warmth. From the moment he stepped in, Zena felt a shadow fall over her life. At first, he acted like a savior, bringing food to the house, speaking sweet words to Bimkwe, and pretending to care. But his mask soon slipped. He didn't love Bimkwe. He wanted control. And the first thing he did was turn her against her own daughter. "You spoil her too much," Bato would whisper in Bimkwe's ear. "She is lazy. She is ungrateful. She will bring shame to this house." Bimkwe, blinded by love or perhaps fear, began to believe him. She stopped defending Zena. The soft words of comfort turned into cold silence. The warm meals she once made for her daughter were now served only to Bato. Zena, once the beloved child of the house, became nothing more than an unwanted burden. But deep in Zena's heart she knew Bato wasn't just cruel, he was dangerous. And her nightmare had only just begun. From the moment Bato took over the household, Zena's life became a living nightmare. He didn't just treat her unfairly, he made sure she felt worthless. Every morning before the sun even stretched across the sky, Zena was already on her feet, sweeping the dirt floors, fetching water from the river, and preparing meals that she was never allowed to eat. If she moved too slowly, Bato's voice would thunder through the house, shaking her to her core. "You useless girl! Do you think this house will clean itself?" he would roar, his sharp eyes burning with cruelty. Zena never dared to argue. The few times she tried, she had learned the hard way. A slap across the face, a shove to the ground. Bato had no mercy, and neither did Bimkwe anymore. Her mother, the woman who had once held her close during storms, who had wiped her tears when she was afraid, was now a stranger. At first, Zena had believed it was just temporary. Maybe Bimkwe would wake up one day and realize the mistake she had made by marrying Bato. Maybe she would see the bruises on Zena's arms, the exhaustion in her eyes, and finally protect her. But that day never came. Instead, Bimkwe changed. She stopped speaking to Zena unless it was to give her orders. She no longer defended her when Bato accused her of being lazy or useless. She never questioned why Zena's body was covered in bruises or why her eyes were always red from crying. It was as if Bato had cast a spell on her, turning her into a woman Zena didn't recognize. Zena was no longer a daughter in that house. She was nothing more than a servant. The villagers of Nadira weren't blind to what was happening. They saw the way Zena's once bright smile had disappeared, how she moved through the village like a ghost, her head always lowered, her body too thin for a girl her age. They heard the shouting from Bato's house at night, the sound of objects breaking, of pain, of suffering, but no one stepped forward. Bato wasn't just cruel, he was feared. He had connections to dangerous men, men who had no problem making people disappear. Everyone in Nadira knew this, and so they turned away. The elders, the very people meant to protect the weak, chose silence over justice. Zena understood. No one was coming to save her. She was alone, and in that loneliness, she made herself a silent promise. If no one would fight for her, she would survive on her own. The night was cold, the kind that made the air feel sharp against the skin. The village of Nadira was quiet, with only the distant sounds of crickets and rustling leaves breaking the silence. But inside Bato's house, there was no peace. Bato sat in the dimly lit room, his breath heavy with the stench of alcohol. His dark, cruel eyes were locked on Zena, who stood trembling before him. She had known this moment would come. She had seen the greed in his eyes, the way he looked at the small silver coins traders carried through the village. But she never thought he would demand her to be the thief. "I told you to go into the marketplace and bring me what I asked for," Bato growled, his voice thick with anger. "Are you deaf, girl?" Zena swallowed hard. She had refused. She had refused because stealing was wrong, because she knew what happened to those caught in the act. Thieves had their hands broken, sometimes worse. But she also knew that nothing she said would change Bato's mind. I can't," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The room fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was the slow, deliberate tapping of Bato's fingers against the wooden table. Then, suddenly, his fist slammed against the surface, making the cups rattle. "You can't?" he repeated, his tone deadly. "Then maybe tonight you will learn obedience." Before Zena could react, his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a bruising grip. She cried out, struggling, but he was too strong. He dragged her across the house, past the kitchen, past Bimkwe, who turned away and pretended not to see, and out into the night. Zena's heart pounded wildly when she realized where he was taking her. The wild dog kennels. The wooden structure sat at the edge of the yard, a cage filled with hungry, snarling beasts. These were not like the village dogs that roamed freely during the day. These were hunting dogs, raised to be fierce, trained to kill. No one went near them after dark. Panic surged through Zena as Bato yanked open the heavy wooden gate and shoved her inside. She stumbled, falling into the cold mud, her hands scraping against the rough ground. The dogs, sensing movement, began to stir, their low growls rumbling through the darkness. Bato laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "Maybe by morning you'll understand what happens when you disobey me," he sneered. And with that, he slammed the gate shut, locking her in with the beasts. Zena's breath came in short gasps as she pressed herself against the wooden wall, her entire body trembling. The dogs circled her, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Their growls deepened, their sharp teeth flashing as they drew closer. She wanted to scream, but she knew no one would help her. The villagers could hear the dogs snarling, scratching, their hunger evident. Some even peeked out from their huts, their eyes flickering with guilt. They knew what was happening, but no one dared to stop it. Bato was too powerful, too dangerous. So they pulled their blankets over their heads, pretending they couldn't hear. And Zena? She was left alone in the darkness, surrounded by teeth, claws, and death itself. Zena pressed her back against the cold wooden wall, her breath shallow, her heart hammering against her ribs. The dogs moved around her, their low growls vibrating through the air, their sharp teeth flashing in the dim moonlight. She could smell them, the musky scent of wild animals, of unwashed fur and raw power. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the pain, for the tearing of flesh, for the end, but it never came. A heavy silence settled over the kennel. Zena slowly opened her eyes to see the largest dog standing before her, its golden eyes locked onto hers. It was the alpha, a massive beast with thick black fur and a scar running down its left eye. The villagers called him Baraka, the Blessed One, but no one dared go near him. He was feared, respected, a leader among the wild pack. Baraka sniffed the air, inching closer, his wet nose brushing against her hand. Zena flinched, but didn't move. Something passed between them in that moment, a silent understanding. And then, instead of attacking, Baraka sat down. The other dogs, still tense, watched their leader. Slowly, one by one, they followed his command. The growling stopped. The snarling faded. Instead of lunging at her, the dogs laid down around her, their eyes wary but no longer hostile. Zena exhaled shakily, her hands trembling as she reached out. She touched Baraka's fur gently, her fingers sinking into the warmth of his thick coat. He didn't flinch. He didn't bite. She wasn't an enemy. She was one of them. Tears welled in Zena's eyes. She had spent so long fearing the world, feeling alone, unwanted, unloved. Yet here, in the place meant to be her grave, she had found something unexpected. Acceptance. Perhaps the dogs remembered. She had often watched them from afar, chained and starving, forgotten by the very people who had once relied on them. Whenever she had the chance, she would sneak scraps of food to them, whispering softly as she passed them through the wooden bars. She had never been afraid of them, even when the villagers warned her. Now, it seemed, they had not forgotten her kindness. That night, instead of shivering in fear, Zena curled up against Baraka, his warm body shielding her from the cold. The other dogs pressed close, forming a protective circle around her. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. Days turned into nights, and nights into weeks. Bato continued his cruelty, locking her away as punishment whenever he pleased. But what he didn't know was that the wild dogs were no longer his weapons. They were Zena's family now. With every passing night, her bond with them grew stronger. She learned their ways, their unspoken language, the flick of an ear, the twitch of a tail, the way they moved as one. She became part of the pack, a sister to the beasts the village feared. And though she was still trapped in a life of suffering, she was no longer alone, because now she had the wild dogs on her side. Bato sat outside his hut, his fingers drumming impatiently on the wooden table. His eyes, dark and filled with frustration, flickered toward the kennels where Zena was locked away. Why was she still alive? The dogs should have torn her apart by now. That was the whole point of throwing her in there, to get rid of her once and for all. But every time he checked, she was still there, sitting among them, as if she belonged. Instead of attacking her, the beasts protected her, guarded her like she was one of their own. It made his blood boil. This girl, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. She's a curse. Bato knew he couldn't let this continue. Keeping her locked up was useless. If the dogs wouldn't kill her, he had to find another way, a better way. And then, like a shadow slithering into his mind, an idea took shape. There were men, dangerous men, who traveled through villages like Nadira, looking for girls to sell. They were ruthless, heartless traders who cared for nothing but profit. They bought the young and the weak, dragging them away to places no one ever returned from. They would pay well for a girl like Zena. A slow, wicked smile spread across Bato's face. Yes, this was the answer. He would be rid of her once and for all, and he would make a fortune in the process. That night, as the fire crackled low and the village settled into silence, Zena overheard everything. She had been creeping toward the hut, desperate for warmth, when she heard Bato's voice. Low, sharp, filled with excitement, she pressed her back against the wall, her heart racing as she listened. "She'll fetch a good price," he was saying. "They're coming in 3 nights. Make sure she's ready." Zena felt the blood drain from her face. She was going to be sold. Terror gripped her chest, her breath coming in short gasps. She had heard the stories. Girls who were taken never returned. They vanished into the unknown, forced into lives of suffering far worse than anything she had endured here. She couldn't let it happen. She had to escape. But how? Bato was always watching. He would never let her go freely. And the villagers? They had already turned their backs on her. Zena sank to the ground, her hands trembling. She had never felt so powerless. But then, a soft nudge against her arm. She looked up to see Baraka, his golden eyes steady, filled with something she couldn't quite understand. Trust, loyalty, strength. And then, she realized something. She wasn't alone. For the first time since her nightmare began, hope flickered inside her. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she would find a way to escape. And when she did, Bato would regret ever laying a hand on her. The storm raged over Nadira, thunder shaking the sky as heavy rain poured down, drenching the village in darkness. The wind howled through the trees, rattling doors and windows. But inside Bato's hut, another storm was brewing. He sat slumped on a stool, a jug of palm wine clutched in his calloused hands. His eyes, red and unfocused, burned with frustration. The thought of Zena still alive, untouched, protected by those cursed dogs, filled him with rage. "She thinks she's safe," he slurred, slamming the jug onto the table. "Thinks she's special." He staggered to his feet, his mind clouded with drink and fury. He had already sold her. The traders would come for her soon. But before that, she needed to learn a lesson, a final lesson. The rain pounded against his skin as he stumbled toward the kennels. His bare feet sank into the mud, his fists clenched, his breath hot with anger. The torches in the village had been blown out by the wind, leaving the world around him dark and eerie. But he didn't care. He reached the kennel, yanked the wooden gate open, and stepped inside. Zena curled in the corner, her body trembling as she pressed herself against the wooden walls. The dogs, their thick fur soaked from the rain, stood around her like a living shield. Bato sneered. "Move, you filthy beasts!" he spat, raising his hand to strike Zena. But this time, the dogs did not move. A low growl rippled through the air. Bato froze. Baraka, the massive alpha, stepped forward, his golden eyes glowing like fire in the darkness. His lips curled back, revealing razor-sharp teeth dripping with rain. The growl grew deeper, vibrating through the kennel like the distant rumble of an earthquake. Bato took a shaky step back, but it was too late. The pack had decided. With a deafening snarl, Baraka lunged. Bato's scream pierced through the storm as sharp teeth sank into his flesh. He swung wildly, trying to fight back, but the dogs were everywhere, biting, clawing, tearing. Zena pressed herself against the wall, watching in shock as the man who had tormented her was finally powerless. The villagers heard the commotion but did nothing. No one dared to stop what had already been set in motion. Bato's cries faded into the night, swallowed by the storm, until finally, silence. The rain washed the blood away, but nothing could erase the truth. The wild dogs had spoken. Zena was no longer the hunted. She was one of them now. The night was deep, the storm wild, but nothing could drown out the terrible sound that tore through the village. A scream, long, raw, and filled with agony. The people of Nadira stirred in their huts, eyes wide with fear. The scream came again, louder, more desperate. It was coming from the kennels. Mothers clutched their children. Elders sat frozen, their hearts pounding. The men exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to move. They all knew whose voice it was. Bato. The growls of the wild dogs echoed through the village, a terrifying chorus of snarls and snapping jaws. The people could hear the struggle, the frantic thrashing, the sound of flesh tearing, the desperate gasps of a man fighting for his life. And then, another sound, a gurgling cry, a final shuddering breath, and then, silence. No one spoke, no one stepped outside. They only listened as the storm raged on, the rain washing away the blood, the wind carrying away the last echoes of Bato's suffering. By dawn, when the storm had finally calmed, a few brave souls gathered near the kennels, their feet hesitant in the mud. What they saw made their blood run cold. The wooden gate hung open, its hinges broken. Deep claw marks lined the ground, mixed with muddy footprints, but there was no body, only shreds of cloth, torn and soaked in rain and blood. Bato was gone. The villagers looked at each other, whispering in hushed tones. Some said the dogs had dragged him into the forest, where no man would ever find him. Others believed it was the spirits of the ancestors, delivering their long-awaited justice. But one thing was certain. Bato had paid for his sins. And Zena? She was no longer a helpless girl. She had survived what no one else could. And the dogs, her only true family now, had made sure she would never suffer again. The morning sun rose slowly over Nadira, casting a golden glow over the damp earth. But the warmth of the new day did nothing to chase away the heavy tension that hung over the village. People gathered in small clusters, whispering, pointing toward the kennels where Bato had met his gruesome fate. The air was thick with unease, with relief, with something none of them dared to say out loud. Then came a scream, not of pain, but of despair. Bimkwe. She stood frozen at the sight of the tattered remains of Bato's clothes, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the wet ground, her face twisted in horror. "No, no, this can't be," she wailed, her voice raw with disbelief. She rocked back and forth, clutching at the mud, as if trying to pull back time, as if trying to undo what had been done. But there was no undoing this. Bato was gone. The man she had once loved, the man she had chosen over her own child, was no more. Tears spilled down her face, not just from grief, but from the terrible realization that she had been blind to the monster she had married, blind to the suffering of her own daughter. Her sobs grew louder, shaking her entire body. Guilt clawed at her like the very dogs that had torn Bato apart. And then, her voice broke. "It's my fault. It's all my fault." The villagers turned, their murmurs hushed. The elders stepped forward, their faces stern but curious. Bimkwe lifted her tear-streaked face, her lips trembling as she spoke, her voice cracking under the weight of her confession. "I let him do it. I let him hurt her." A gasp rippled through the crowd. She cried harder, the truth pouring out like a flood. She told them everything, how Bato had controlled her, poisoned her mind, made her believe Zena was the problem, how she had ignored her daughter's suffering, turned away when Zena needed her most. She had been a mother, in name only, and now she had lost everything. The elders listened in silence, their eyes heavy with wisdom, with understanding. When Bimkwe finished speaking, her body shook with sobs, her hands clawing at the mud, as if begging the earth itself for forgiveness. Finally, Elder Kafel, the oldest and most respected among them, stepped forward. His deep voice carried over the crowd, steady and full of finality. Zena was always innocent. She was the one who suffered, the one who was wronged, and justice has been served. The villagers nodded in agreement. Bato's cruelty had been punished, not by them, but by the very forces he had underestimated. The wild dogs, the guardians of the forest, had passed their judgment. Zena had survived, and Bato had not. Bimkwe sobbed harder, her hands gripping her chest, as if she could hold the pieces of her shattered soul together. But nothing could take away her guilt. She had betrayed her daughter, and now she would have to live with the weight of that betrayal for the rest of her life. The village of Nadira had changed forever. The name Zena was no longer whispered in pity or fear. It was spoken with awe and respect. The girl who had once been treated as nothing, who had suffered under the hands of a cruel stepfather, had survived what no one else could. Elder Kamari, the wisest and most respected leader of the village, stepped forward on the morning after Bato's demise. His deep, thoughtful eyes studied Zena, who stood among the people, weary but unbroken. "Come, child," he said. "Your time of suffering is over. Now you must rise." Zena was taken under his wing, brought into his home, a place of wisdom, healing, and leadership. For the first time in her life, she felt safe. Elder Kamari saw something in her that others had ignored: strength, resilience, and the heart of a leader. Under his guidance, Zena learned the ways of the healers. She studied the herbs of the forest, the power of words, the wisdom of the ancestors. The pain she had endured had sharpened her spirit, giving her an understanding of suffering that no one else had. And as she learned, so did the village. The wild dogs that once lived in fear, hidden behind locked gates, were no longer seen as dangerous beasts. They had been the ones to bring justice when no one else dared. The people of Nadira began to feed them, care for them, respect them. The dogs, once feared, now walked freely among the villagers, standing guard over the weak, keeping watch at night. Zena, the girl who had once slept in the kennels as a punishment, was now seen as their leader. Stories of her survival spread far beyond Nadira. Travelers from other villages came to hear the tale of the girl who had tamed the wild, of the stepfather who had met his end through the very beasts he had tried to use as weapons. People whispered the story in hushed tones, some with fear, others with admiration. She was thrown to the wild dogs, but they did not harm her. Instead, they turned against her oppressor. It was karma, a lesson from the ancestors. Zena was meant for greater things, and she was. With time, Elder Kamari stepped down, passing her leadership to her. The people chose her, not out of tradition, but out of love. She had earned their trust. She had survived, not with power or cruelty, but with kindness, strength, and the unbreakable will to live. Zena, once a helpless orphan, now ruled with wisdom, and by her side, always, were the wild dogs, the guardians of Nadira. The village of Nadira was never the same again. What was once a place filled with whispered fears and silent suffering had transformed into a land of justice and wisdom. And at the heart of this transformation was Zena, the girl who had once been treated as nothing, now standing as the village's greatest guardian. Years had passed, but the memory of that fateful night remained fresh in the minds of the people. The night Bato met his end, the night the wild dogs chose justice over fear. It was the night that changed everything. Under Zena's guidance, Nadira flourished. She ruled not with power, not with fear, but with understanding. She knew what it meant to suffer, to be betrayed, to be alone. That pain had shaped her, but it had not broken her. Instead, it had made her stronger. People from nearby villages came seeking her wisdom. She healed the sick, settled disputes, and made sure that no child in Nadira ever suffered as she once had. The weak were protected. The wicked were held accountable. No one would be ignored again. And by her side always were the wild dogs. Once feared, they now walked freely among the villagers. They were guardians, protectors, family, no longer locked away in dark kennels, no longer used as weapons of cruelty. They belonged to Nadira, and Nadira belonged to them. Children grew up hearing the story of the girl who tamed the wild dogs. The tale was told around fires, whispered in hushed voices, passed from generation to generation. She was cast out, but she survived. She had no one, but the wild dogs became her family. She faced cruelty, but in the end, justice was served. It was no longer just a story. It was a lesson about kindness, about strength, about the way the universe never forgets. Those who do evil will face their fate, and those who suffer will one day rise. And so the legend of Zena lived on. not just in words, not just in memory, but in the very heart of Nadira itself.